easy to purchase. When you're the vice president of a successful Hollywood software firm and live in a $2 million mansion, you may find there are not many material things that are out of your reach, no matter what kind of strange addiction or fetish you may or may not have. But Legos? Now, there was no reason he couldn't go and purchase his Legos like every other millionaire, but he decided that, of course, would be too easy. Instead, he forged fake barcodes, which he simply pasted on top of real barcodes in order to get his Lego sets at a fifth the regular price. The minimum wage cashiers were not prepared to detect barcode fraud, and he managed to pull this off at multiple target locations. Eventually, they detected something was fishy, and his name and picture were circulated. Soon enough, he was caught red-handed, with his pockets loaded with fraudulent barcodes. When his house was searched, they actually found thousands of unopened Lego boxes that he had been selling on eBay for a profit of over $30,000. But that figure doesn't take into account Target's loss of profit. It just goes to show you can't fill the empty hole in your heart with tons of fraudulent Lego. The United States Navy Veterans Association. Have you ever wanted to open up a charity, host a charity auction, or sell lemonade to send kids to camp and then simply pocket the cash? No, of course not. That's ludicrous, because you are good people and would never do anything like that, right? Bobby Thompson was not. In 2002, a charity known as the United States Navy Veterans Association was founded, quote, to assist veterans and members of the U.S. Armed Forces and their families. It had everything you would expect such a charity to have. Tax-exempt status, 41 state chapters, and 66,000 members. Or so that's what we were told. A total of 8 years passed before an investigation was launched revealing that the entire operation was run by one man named John Donald Cody, also known as Bobby Thompson. He went into hiding for 2 years and was only convicted in 2013 for theft, money laundering, corrupt activity, and tampering with records. The U.S. government estimates he collected at least $20 million nationally. Sadly for him, however, he won't be released from prison until 2039. And so he turned water into gasoline. Today's gas prices are significantly lower than they have been in the past, so oil isn't quite as profitable. But despite the declining oil prices, wouldn't you want the ability to turn water into gasoline? Perhaps a slightly more impressive feat than the time the bearded guy supposedly turned water into wine. Wang Hongchen told the Chinese government that with significant funding, he would develop a chemical formula that could turn water into gasoline. He was only an amateur chemist at the time, but strangely enough, it worked. And the government, along with several other organizations, invested heavily into his work. 10 years later, in the 90s, he had accrued $37 million in funding. But of course, he was never able to deliver on his promise and was sent to prison for fraud. There is a small following, however, that believe in a conspiracy claiming that he did manage to make the formula, but refused to reveal the secret, and that's why the government imprisoned him. If that isn't the case, I can't help but wonder what Hongchen would have been thinking over those 10 years. Was he actually trying to work out the formula, or was he just riding on the cash, knowing he would be found out eventually? The POVAIS colony scheme. Not every major scam happens in the modern era. In some ways, it was easier to scam someone long ago, as there were fewer laws to deal with, and a lack of long-distance communication meant information didn't travel anywhere near as fast as it does today. Plus, most people didn't really know much about the world around them, making it easy for Englishman Gregor McGregor to convince his countrymen of land on the coast of South America called POVAIS, full of resources and just waiting for them to settle. To back up his claims, he produced maps and charts proving and pinpointing the land, colony, and location. Over 250 colonists actually set out for South America, only to find the dense South American jungle waiting for them. Very few survived, but by then, McGregor was already working his scam again, this time in France. His plan was ingenious because he could charge for the information and maps, but nobody would return and be able to prove his findings false. the 1911 Mona Lisa sale. Some of the best scams involve the most complex of plans, especially those concerning the sale of multiple Mona Lisa forgeries. The plan was as follows. Argentinian Eduardo de Valfierno hired a Louvre employee to steal the Mona Lisa. While a feat in itself, that was not the extent of his plans. He only wanted the painting stolen so he could sell several forgeries across the world instead of just one painting. Since word of the Mona Lisa being stolen had spread quickly, clients would have had a fair bit of reason to believe the one he was selling was the original. As soon as the copies were sold, many collectors were convinced that they had the original. As payment for doing all the hard work, he even allowed the thief to keep the original painting, which was a mistake, as the thief was eventually caught in 1913 attempting to sell the painting, and the whole scam collapsed. Despite the bust, it was far too late for those who had purchased the forgeries, as there was nothing really that they could do. They couldn't quite walk up to the police station and explain that they had been ripped off while trying to buy stolen art, now could they? Millions of dollars were lifted off of Valfierno's gullible clients, and all ended up in the pockets of the government. The Eiffel Tower sale. When pulling off major scams, you either need to make your own opportunities or patiently wait for them to come along. War, of course, is a big opportunity in many ways. Back in World War I, you could make millions selling arms and armaments to both sides, further escalating the conflict, all the while lining your pocket. Of course, the events of World War I left massive destruction in their wake, especially in France. In fact, Paris was in such poor shape that the city could barely afford to maintain the Eiffel Tower, as keeping it painted requires 50 to 60 tons of paint every 7 years. This, of course, was seen as an opportunity for Victor Lustig, who decided he would sell the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal. He forged government stationery and invited 6 scrap metal dealers to the most prestigious hotel in Paris to discuss making a deal. He told them the upkeep was so ridiculous that the city couldn't afford it, and it had to be kept quiet due to public outrage. Lustig decided to make a deal with very insecure dealer André Puisson, who wanted to earn prestige by purchasing the tower. Puisson's wife smelled the fraud, but Lustig confessed that he wasn't making enough money as a government official and needed to keep the deal secret. Puisson understood immediately and paid Lustig a small fortune up front. Lustig then escaped to Vienna with a case full of cash, but the dealer he had scammed was so embarrassed that he never reported it. Lustig would return to Paris years later to sell the tower again, but this time the scam was reported and he was forced to flee to the United States. The sale of an empire. This next one's a bit of a doozy. You may have heard of some pretty ludicrous things being sold, but none of them amount to what it must take to sell an entire empire, especially one as large as the Roman Empire. Now, how do you sell an empire, you ask? Well, first you murder its emperor, and then you open up the position to the highest bidder. Eventually, an aristocrat named Julianus managed to win this bidding war for the modest price of 250 gold pieces per soldier of the Praetorian Guard. Despite each soldier being responsible for the defense of the emperor, they ended up being the ones that murdered him. The total price paid for the assassination in today's currency is roughly $1 billion, and despite paying that out, Julianus obviously didn't have a large enough army to stand as an emperor for long. You see, the Praetorian Guard did not actually have the ability to put a new emperor on the throne, nor have any control over who was next in line. They just said they did so they could pocket some quick cash. Upon the public learning this, Julianus was quickly and easily deposed of by another emperor, who felt he had a larger claim to the throne. The fraudulent guards got what was coming to them as well, as the very first order of the new emperor was to have them all executed. Catch me if you can. A conman named Frank Abagnale spent most of the 1960s touring the world and writing bad checks as a conman does. But he wasn't just any conman, and made much more than the average 60s greaser. His ventures crossed through 26 countries, in which he impersonated lawyers, doctors, and teachers for a total of 8 different personas, all the while scamming the banks using multiple methods of check forgery for a total of $2.5 million. His adventures are of course publicly known through the movie Catch Me If You Can. Starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank Abagnale, he conned $2.5 million, escaped custody twice from federal penitentiary, and evaded a taxiing airliner all before he was 21, with his first attempt at fraud happening when he was only 15. Unlike other con men, Frank Abagnale got off fairly lightly, spending a grand total of only 5 years in prison, after which he was enlisted in the government to fight against other scam artists. He is still alive and a millionaire no less, and runs his own fraud consultancy agency. The Saguchi Airport Investment. The easiest way to craft a successful scam is to impersonate someone and use their social standing to convince people that what they are putting their money towards is completely legit. That's what Emmanuel Nwude did to Nelson Saguchi, director of the Bank of Noreste in Brazil. He pretended to be Paul Ogwuma, governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and convinced Saguchi that he was building an airport in the nation's capital and needed funding in exchange for a $10 million commission. He extracted a total of $242 million in cash and interest before the ownership of the bank changed in 1997 when it was taken over. The new owners found it curious that 2/5 of their newly acquired bank's funds was sitting in the Cayman Islands doing absolutely nothing, prompting a large-scale investigation. As the scam fell to pieces, Nwude was arrested, but due to a spree of supposed bribery, it seemed Nwude and his accomplices might get off completely scot-free. Unluckily for them, however, the Nigerian parliament created the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, which allowed them to arrest Nwude and his accomplices on 86 charges of fraud and 15 counts of bribery. We wish him luck in walking away from that. The MADOFF-PONZI scheme. The whole point of a good scam is to make off with a large amount of money with minimal effort and little personal loss. In the case of a Ponzi scheme, this means running a business and asking for investments with high and secure returns. But where would you get the money to pay off these investors, you ask? Through the investments of others, of course. Until you bring in enough investors that you can make millions skimming cash off the top each time you pass the money back and forth. This is what Bernard L. Madoff did when he founded the Wall Street firm Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities in 1960. Amazingly, he wasn't caught until 2008, when his sons alerted the authorities. He pled guilty to 11 federal crimes and to operating the largest Ponzi scheme in history. Authorities estimate his scheme netted roughly $64.8 billion US, for which Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison. This scheme is the largest example of accounting fraud in U.S. history, and it was such a large operation that it froze the funds of multiple organizations and caused companies to go bankrupt.